What I'd like to share with you is something that I haven't wrote, I haven't found. This is not my material. This was shared by Roz on Facebook, but I really felt like it was something that, as a church, it would do us good to hear. And it's called Those Who Sow in Tears. In 1921, David and Svea Flood went with their 2-year-old son from Sweden to the heart of Africa, to what was called the Belgian Congo. This missionary couple met up with the Ericsons, another young Scandinavian couple, and the four of them sought God for direction. In those days, much devotion and sacrifice took place, and they felt led of the Lord to set out from the main mission station to take the gospel to the village of Ndoloro, a remote area. This was a huge step of faith. There they were rebuffed by the chief, who would not let them enter his town for fear of alienating the local gods. The two couples opted to build their own mud hut half a mile up the slope. They prayed for a spiritual breakthrough, but there was none. Their only contact with the villagers was a young boy who was allowed to sell them chickens and eggs twice a week. Svea Flood, a tiny woman of only 4 foot 8 inches tall, decided that if this was the only African she could talk to, she would try and lead the boy to Jesus. And she succeeded. Meanwhile, malaria struck one member of this little missionary band after another. In time, the Ericsons decided they'd had enough suffering and left to return to the central mission station. David and Svea Flood remained in Ndoloro to carry on alone. Then Svea found herself pregnant in the middle of this wilderness. When the time came for her to give birth, the village chief softened enough to allow a midwife to help her, and the little girl was born, whom they named Aggie. The delivery was exhausting, and Svea was already weak from bouts of malaria, so that the birthing process was a heavy blow to her stamina. She died only 17 days after Aggie was born. Something snapped inside of David Flood at that moment. He dug a crude grave, buried his 27-year-old wife, and went back down the mountain with his children to the mission station. Giving baby Aggie to the Ericsons, he snarled, "I'm going back to Sweden. I've lost my wife, and I obviously can't take care of this baby. God has ruined my life." With that, he headed for the port, rejecting not only his calling, but God himself. Within 8 months, both the Ericsons were stricken with a mysterious malady and died within days of each other. Baby Aggie was then turned over to another American missionary family, who changed her to a Swedish name, Aggie. Eventually, they took her back to the United States at age 3. This family loved Aggie, afraid that if they tried to return to Africa, some legal obstacle might separate her from them. They decided to stay in their home country and switch from missionary work to pastoral ministry. That is how Aggie grew up in South Dakota. As a young woman, she attended North Central Bible College in Minneapolis. There she met and married Dewey Hurst. Years passed. The Hursts enjoyed a fruitful ministry. Aggie gave birth to her, first to a daughter and then to a son. In time, her husband became a president of a Christian college in the Seattle area, and Aggie was intrigued to find so much Scandinavian heritage there. One day she found a Swedish religious magazine in their mailbox. She had no idea who sent it, and of course she couldn't read the words, but as she turned the pages, a photo suddenly stopped her cold. There, in a primitive setting, was a grave with a white cross, and on the cross were the words, Svea Flood. Aggie got in a car and drove straight to a college faculty member who she knew would translate the article. What does this say? The teacher shared a summary of the story. It's about missionaries who went to Ndoloro in Africa long ago. A baby was born. The young mother died. One little African boy was led to Jesus before that, After the whites had all left, the boy grew up and persuaded the chief of the village to let him build a school in the village. He gradually won all of his students to Christ, and the children led their parents to them. Even the chief became a follower of Jesus. Today there are 600 believers in that village, all because of the sacrifice of David and Svea Flood. Aggie was elated. For the Hursts' 25th wedding anniversary, the college presented them with a gift of a vacation to Sweden. Aggie sought out her birth father. David Flood was an old man now. He had remarried, fathered 4 more children, and generally dissipated his life with alcohol. He had recently suffered a stroke. Still bitter, he had one rule in his family: never mention the name of God, because God took everything from me. After an emotional reunion with her half-brothers and half-sister, Aggie brought up the subject of her longing to see her father. They hesitated. You can talk to him, but he's very ill now. You need to know, whenever he hears the name of God, he flies into a rage. Aggie walked into the squalid apartment, which had liquor bottles strewn everywhere, and slowly approached her 73-year-old father, lying in a rumpled bed. "Papa," she said tentatively. He turned and began to cry. "Anya, I never meant to give you away." "It's all right, Papa," she said, taking him gently in her arms. "God took care of me." Her father instantly stiffened and his tears stopped. "God forgot all about us. Our lives have been like this because of him." And he turned his face back to the wall. Aggie stroked his face and then continued, undaunted. "Papa, I've got a marvellous story to tell you. You didn't go to Africa in vain. Mama didn't die in vain. That little boy you won to the Lord grew up and won that whole village to Jesus. The one seed you planted in his heart kept growing and growing. Today there are 600 people serving the Lord because you were faithful to the call of God in your life. Papa, Jesus loves you. He has never hated you or abandoned us." The old father turned back to look into his daughter's eyes, and his body relaxed. Slowly he began to talk. By the end of the afternoon, he had come back to the God he had resented for so many years. Over the next few days, father and daughter enjoyed warm moments together. A few weeks after, Aggie and her husband returned to America, and just after that, David Flood died. Then, a few years later, Aggie and her husband were attending an evangelism conference in London, where a report was given from the Zaire, the former Belgian Congo. The superintendent of the National Church, representing 110,000 baptized believers, spoke eloquently of the gospel spread in his nation. Aggie could not help going to ask him afterwards if he'd ever heard of David and Svea Flood. "Yes, madam," the man replied in French, his words being translated into English. "Svea Flood led me to Jesus Christ. I was the boy who brought food to your parents before you were born. In fact, to this day, your mother's grave and her memory are honoured by all of us." He embraced Aggie for a long time, sobbing, "You must come to Zaire. Your mother is the most famous and honoured person in our history." When Aggie and her husband went to Ndalero, they were welcomed by the cheering throngs of villagers. Aggie even met the man who had been hired by her father to carry her down the mountain in a hammock cradle. Then the pastor escorted Aggie to see her mother's tomb with a white cross, bearing her name. She knelt in the soil to pray and give thanks to God. Later that day in the church, the boy who became pastor read, "I tell you the truth, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds." John 12:24. Those who sow in tears will reap with songs of joy. Psalm 126:5. What an amazing story, and what an amazing encouragement. When we share the gospel, we don't see the big picture, but God does, and God can do far more than we can imagine.